Welcome to tonight's journey through Berlin's dark past, a city whose story is etched in tragedy, revolution, and resilience. From the Prussian military dominance that shaped its rise, to the horrors of Nazi rule, and the divisions brought on by the Berlin Wall, Berlin's history is one of profound change and brutal transitions. Tonight, we'll uncover the turbulent chapters of this storied city, a tale of survival, oppression, and revolution. But before we dive into the dark corners of history, take a moment to relax, get comfortable, and let the stories of Berlin's past wrap around you like the very streets of the city itself. The journey we take tonight will guide you through the foundation of Berlin, from its humble beginnings to its rise as a powerhouse of the Prussian Empire. From there, we'll move through the darkness of World War II, explore the painful division of the city during the Cold War, and the eventual reunification of a once broken city. Along the way, we'll look at the struggles and triumphs that shaped Berlin into what it is today. We'll ask questions and explore the bravery and resilience that has carried the city and its people through unimaginable hardship. Before we embark on this journey, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? It's always fascinating to see how far this story travels and how people across the globe are drawn to these stories of history and survival. Leave a comment below and let me know where you're tuning in from. I love reading your responses. Now, let us begin this journey through the dark history of Berlin, where we'll explore the rise of the Prussian military, the grip of Nazi oppression, and the divided city that faced the trials of the Cold War and the eventual unification. Berlin's story begins long before the Prussian Empire claimed its place in the world's history. It starts in the 12th century, in an area that was little more than a small settlement by the banks of the Spree River. The name, Berlin, itself is believed to derive from the Old Slavic word, berl, meaning swamp or marsh. The city's humble beginnings as a small fishing village, connected by trade routes but isolated by the marshland surrounding it, hinted at its potential but did not immediately promise the grandeur that would come to define it centuries later. Berlin's first recorded mention came in 1237, when it was recognized as a town. At this point, the city was still far from the military and cultural capital it would become. In fact, it wasn't until the 14th century, when the Hohenzollern dynasty took control of the city, that Berlin began to shift from a small, modest settlement into a major European center. The rise of Berlin as a significant city was intimately tied to the ambitions of the Hohenzollern family, who would go on to shape the future of both the city and the Prussian state. In 1417, Frederick I of the Hohenzollern dynasty became the Elector of Brandenburg, marking the beginning of Berlin's evolution into a more powerful political and military hub. This marked the beginning of the Prussian state under the Hohenzollerns, though it would take centuries before Berlin became the imposing capital we know today. At this point, Brandenburg was just one of many territories in what was still a fragmented Holy Roman Empire. However, over the coming centuries, the Hohenzollern family worked diligently to strengthen Brandenburg's position and expand its borders, laying the groundwork for Berlin's eventual rise to power. Berlin began its ascent in the 15th century under the leadership of Frederick II of Brandenburg, known as Frederick the Great. Though he didn't live to see the full fruition of his efforts, Frederick's political savvy, military ambition, and territorial expansion laid the foundation for the Prussian military state that would come to dominate Europe. As the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, ravaged Europe, Brandenburg Prussia emerged as one of the few territories to survive relatively intact. Despite the devastation surrounding it, Berlin's strategic location helped it gain importance in European politics, and its military strength began to flourish. Perhaps no figure shaped Berlin's early history more than Frederick William, also known as the Great Elector. Ascending to power in 1640, he inherited a relatively modest and fragmented Brandenburg Prussia. However, through strategic alliances, territorial expansion, and his vision of military strength, he transformed Brandenburg Prussia into a rising power in Europe. One of Frederick William's most significant contributions was his establishment of a standing army, something that would become the hallmark of Prussian dominance. He built a highly disciplined, well-trained military force, which would later become a model for the rest of Europe. His reforms to the military system laid the groundwork for the future Prussian army, one of the most formidable military forces in Europe by the 18th century. In addition to his military innovations, Frederick William also implemented sweeping reforms to stabilize the economy and govern his territories more effectively. He promoted religious tolerance, centralized his authority, and improved infrastructure. Under his leadership, Berlin began to grow into a city of influence, and the Prussian state started to shift from an isolated collection of territories into a formidable European power. By the end of the 17th century, the once modest settlement of Berlin had begun to evolve into the political heart of Prussia. The city, though still a relatively small capital compared to the likes of Paris or London, became a hub of intellectual life, artistic expression, and military strategy. As the capital of the Prussian state, Berlin was home to the monarch's court, the center of political decision-making, and a thriving center of commerce. In the early 18th century, Frederick I, the first king of Prussia, moved his court from the small town of Königsberg to Berlin. Under his reign, the city grew rapidly in both size and importance. Frederick I's construction of Prussian palaces and his patronage of the arts transformed the urban landscape, turning Berlin into a symbol of Baroque grandeur and royal ambition. But it wasn't just about luxury and style. Berlin was quickly becoming a military capital, with the Prussian monarchy working hard to build its military and political influence. The true transformation of Berlin into a military powerhouse came during the reign of Frederick II, known as Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great, who ruled from 1740 to 1786, would go on to be one of the most influential monarchs in European history. His military strategies, his enlightened absolutism, and his cultural contributions would define the legacy of Prussia, and Berlin, forever. Frederick was a military genius. Under his rule, the Prussian army became renowned for its discipline, tactics, and efficiency. The army's stunning victories in the Silesian Wars and the 7 Years' War established Prussia as a dominant force in Europe. Berlin, under Frederick's rule, became the epicenter of Prussian military planning and strategy. Frederick's influence also extended beyond the battlefield. He was an advocate for cultural development and intellectual progress. The city of Berlin became a center for philosophers, artists, and scientists during this time, with figures like Voltaire and Immanuel Kant interacting with the Prussian court. Frederick the Great not only expanded the boundaries of Prussia but also helped foster the cultural identity of Berlin as a center of intellectual thought and military might. Under his reign, the city underwent significant architectural and urban changes. Frederick commissioned the construction of Berlin's iconic landmarks, such as the Brandenburg Gate, the Charlottenburg Palace, and the Berlin State Opera, buildings that would later become symbols of the city's glory and its military power. By the time Frederick the Great passed away in 1786, Berlin had firmly cemented its position as the heart of Prussia. The city was not just a capital but a strategic center for a growing military empire. The Prussian military, one of the best trained and most disciplined forces in the world, remained the centerpiece of Berlin's identity, shaping both the city's culture and its place on the world stage. Berlin's growing influence in the 18th century marked a shift in European power dynamics. Prussia, under the leadership of the Hohenzollern dynasty, would become a dominant player in European politics, influencing everything from the Wars of the Austrian Succession to the Napoleonic Wars. The rise of Prussia and Berlin's pivotal role in this rise laid the groundwork for the German Empire in the late 19th century, which would eventually lead to Berlin's rise as the capital of a unified German state. After the reign of Frederick the Great, Berlin stood as the political and cultural heart of Prussia, a rising power in Europe. But by the mid-19th century, the world had changed. Industrialization was sweeping across Europe, reshaping not only cities but also the very fabric of society. As Prussia continued to grow and evolve, Berlin was on the cusp of becoming something even more significant, the capital of a unified German empire. In this segment, we will examine the 19th century, a time of political upheaval, military conflict, and industrial revolution. Berlin, long associated with military strength, would become the epicenter of the forces that led to the unification of Germany under Otto von Bismarck. This period saw the rise of a new Germany, one that would dominate European affairs for decades to come, with Berlin at its heart. We will explore how Berlin's social, economic, and political landscapes shifted as it transformed from a military capital into a bustling center of industry, culture, and political power. This was an era in which the city's architectural grandeur grew alongside its influence in the newly formed German Empire. By the early 19th century, Europe was experiencing the full force of the Industrial Revolution, and Berlin, though still a major military and cultural hub, could no longer afford to stand still. The economic growth of the city was tied to its industrialization, as factories and railroads began to reshape its landscape. This transformation was not only about economic growth but also about Berlin's shift from being a military power to becoming a global industrial center. The growth of industry in Berlin led to the expansion of its infrastructure. Railroads connected Berlin to other major European cities, turning it into a vital transportation hub. The Spree River, once a site of simple trade, now saw a rapid influx of ships carrying goods to and from the city's industrial complexes. As the city expanded, Berlin's population grew rapidly. In the mid-1800s, Berlin had around 500,000 inhabitants. By the century's end, that number had swelled to over 2 million. This population boom was fueled by the industrial economy, drawing workers from across Germany and beyond. Urbanization fundamentally altered Berlin's social and political landscape, creating new challenges but also new opportunities. One of the most significant developments was the creation of new neighborhoods, specifically designed to house the growing working class. The Industrial Revolution in Berlin spurred the creation of factories, and with them, a burgeoning working-class population. This new demographic shift was crucial in shaping Berlin's identity as a center of industry and commerce. While Berlin was undergoing a physical transformation, Prussia's political landscape was also evolving. The most significant development of the mid-19th century was the rise of Otto von Bismarck, who would go on to become the architect of the German Empire. Bismarck's political brilliance and pragmatic approach would lead to the unification of Germany, and Berlin would be at the center of this monumental change. In the 1860s, Bismarck became the Prime Minister of Prussia and began laying the groundwork for a unified Germany under Prussian leadership. His approach was marked by realpolitik, a pragmatic, often ruthless, approach to politics that prioritized national unity over ideology. At the time, Germany was a collection of independent states, many of which had their own interests and agendas. Bismarck recognized that in order to create a united Germany, Prussia would need to assert its military and political dominance. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866 was the first significant step in Bismarck's plan. By defeating Austria, Bismarck was able to exclude the Austrians from a unified German state and establish the North German Confederation, a military alliance led by Prussia. Berlin was now not only the capital of Prussia but also the political center of the newly formed North German Confederation. In 1870, Bismarck orchestrated the Franco-Prussian War, which would unite the remaining independent German states under Prussia's leadership. The victory over France and the subsequent establishment of the German Empire in 1871 solidified Berlin's position as the capital of a united Germany. Berlin's newfound status as the capital of the German Empire marked the beginning of a new era. Under the leadership of Kaiser Wilhelm I and later his son Kaiser Wilhelm II, Berlin became a symbol of imperial power, and the city's growth mirrored the rise of Germany as a major player on the world stage. The city's influence was not confined to military power alone. The German Empire was also marked by economic growth and cultural expansion. Berlin became the focal point of German industrial power, and the city's factories, banks, and businesses grew alongside its political importance. During this time, Berlin's skyline changed dramatically, with grand new buildings and imperial palaces rising to reflect the empire's prestige. This period also saw the development of Berlin's cultural life, as it became one of the most important cultural capitals in Europe. Museums, theaters, and opera houses flourished, while Berlin became a magnet for artists, philosophers, and intellectuals. Berlin's universities, particularly the Humboldt University, became leading centers for higher education, attracting scholars from around the world. Berlin's growth was not just a story of political and economic success, it was also marked by the social and cultural changes of a modern city. However, beneath the surface of the empire's grandiosity lay deep social divides. The growing working class began to demand better living and working conditions, leading to social unrest and the rise of political movements advocating for reform. As Berlin's industrial base grew, so did its working class. By the late 19th century, social inequality was one of the city's most pressing issues. While the industrialists and elites lived in luxury, the workers toiled in poor conditions, facing long hours in factories with little pay. The gap between the rich and the poor became more pronounced, and social movements began to grow in strength. Berlin became the center of the growing labor movement in Germany. Political groups advocating for workers' rights, such as the Social Democratic Party, SPD, gained momentum and began to challenge the political establishment. The city saw strikes, protests, and labor demonstrations as workers pushed for better wages, safer working conditions, and universal suffrage. These movements, while initially suppressed by the imperial government, would lay the groundwork for the revolutionary movements of the 20th century. The social unrest in Berlin would eventually contribute to the fall of the German Empire and the rise of Weimar Germany after World War I. Alongside these political and social changes, Berlin underwent a dramatic transformation in its urban landscape. The city's rapid expansion and industrialization created new neighborhoods, and the urban infrastructure began to modernize. Railways and streetcars connected the sprawling city, while large parks, boulevards, and public spaces were created to accommodate the growing population. The iconic Unter den Linden, one of Berlin's grandest boulevards, was expanded during this period, and new districts like Charlottenburg and Kreuzberg emerged as working-class neighborhoods. These neighborhoods provided housing for the influx of laborers and immigrants from rural Germany and abroad, creating a complex and diverse cityscape. At the same time, class divisions were reflected in the city's architecture. While the upper classes resided in grand palaces and private mansions, the working class was often relegated to overcrowded and poorly constructed apartment buildings. This physical manifestation of social inequality was felt throughout the city, and it would continue to shape Berlin's social dynamics into the 20th century. By the close of the 19th century, Berlin had transformed from a small Prussian capital to a global city, a beacon of both industrial power and cultural prestige. As the heart of the German Empire, the city had grown to embody the military might, economic progress, and social struggles of modern Germany. Berlin's role as the capital of the German Empire was pivotal in shaping the course of European history, but it was also a city torn by its own internal contradictions. As we move into the 20th century, Berlin would experience even greater challenges: war, division, and the ultimate destruction of the empire. Yet, as we've seen, the seeds of Berlin's transformation into a modern cultural and political hub were planted in this period of rapid change. As the 19th century progressed, Berlin began to evolve dramatically. Gone were the days of Prussian military dominance and the influence of the Hohenzollern dynasty on military strategy. Instead, the city found itself at the forefront of industrialization, a transition that fundamentally altered its social, economic, and political landscapes. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in Britain in the late 18th century, now spread across Europe, and by the early 1800s, Berlin, once a relatively small capital of the Prussian state, was being reshaped by the forces of urbanization, technological innovation, and mass production. The Spree River was no longer just a trade route, it was the lifeblood of a burgeoning industrial economy, spurred by factories, railroads, and the steady influx of both workers and immigrants. This period marked a profound shift in Berlin's identity. The city's geography remained largely unchanged, but its economic foundation was shifting from military and political power to industrial and commercial dominance. For the first time in its history, Berlin's streets were filled not only with noblemen and soldiers, but with an emerging working class, struggling to make their way in a city that was growing faster than anyone had anticipated. The rapid industrialization of Berlin came with a wave of technological advancements that transformed the city's infrastructure. Factories and manufacturing plants began to emerge along the Spree, turning Berlin into an industrial powerhouse. The city's population grew exponentially, swelling from about 500,000 in the early 1800s to over 2 million by the end of the century. The influx of workers from rural parts of Prussia and neighboring regions flooded the city, looking for better opportunities in the rapidly expanding industrial sector. As Berlin grew, so did its need for modern infrastructure. The construction of railroads became one of the most significant urban projects in the city's history. The Berlin-Potsdam Railway, completed in 1838, was one of the first major rail links to the surrounding countryside, connecting the city with vital trading routes. By the mid-century, more railroads crisscrossed Berlin, connecting it to Hamburg, Frankfurt, and even Vienna. These rail lines were critical to the economic expansion of Berlin, facilitating the movement of both goods and people. But it wasn't just railroads that transformed the city. The electricity revolution also played a key role. By the late 19th century, Berlin became one of the first cities in Europe to implement electric street lighting, a symbol of the city's growing modernity. Factories powered by steam engines and later by electricity became a central part of Berlin's economy, making it a key player in the German Empire's Industrial Revolution. Along with these changes came significant shifts in the social structure of Berlin. The creation of the working class, made up of factory workers, laborers, and artisans, added a new layer of complexity to the city's demographics. This new social class, often living in overcrowded tenements, was subjected to poor working conditions, long hours, and minimal pay. Meanwhile, a small but growing middle class of professionals, merchants, and entrepreneurs began to thrive in the city's expanding economy. The rise of the working class led to the development of social movements and political ideologies that would become increasingly influential throughout the century. Labor unions were founded, workers organized protests, and calls for political reform grew louder. The class divide in Berlin became more pronounced than ever, leading to political tensions that would shape the city's future. As Berlin's industrialization progressed, the city's role as the political heart of the Prussian state began to evolve. Prussia, under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, had become a major military and political power in Europe, and by the middle of the century, the ambition to unite Germany was in full force. Otto von Bismarck, appointed Prime Minister of Prussia in 1862, played a central role in orchestrating the unification of Germany. His policy of Realpolitik, or politics based on practical considerations rather than moral or ideological concerns, would bring about the end of centuries of fragmentation in the German-speaking world. Bismarck's first step toward German unification was to consolidate the power of the North German Confederation, a union of northern German states dominated by Prussia. At the same time, he carefully crafted alliances with other European powers, including Austria, and eventually engineered the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. The victory over France in that war brought about the final unification of the German Empire under Prussian leadership in 1871, with Berlin becoming the capital of the newly formed German state. This was a monumental shift in Berlin's role within Europe. What had once been the capital of Prussia became the capital of a unified Germany, and the city's political, cultural, and military influence expanded accordingly. Under the new Kaiser Wilhelm I, Berlin would see an influx of wealth, resources, and intellectual capital that solidified its position as one of the major capitals of Europe. The second half of the 19th century saw Berlin begin to assert itself as a cultural center as well as a political one. Frederick the Great had laid the groundwork for Berlin's cultural prominence, but it was in the 19th century that the city truly flourished in the arts, literature, and philosophy. Berlin became a meeting place for some of the greatest minds of the era, from philosophers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels to artists, writers, and musicians. The city's intellectual scene was vibrant, with institutions like the Humboldt University playing a central role in European education and scholarship. Berlin was home to the rise of German idealism, with figures such as Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and Wilhelm von Humboldt shaping philosophical discourse. The literary salons of the period brought together thinkers, politicians, and artists in discussions that would shape the cultural and political landscape of Europe. But the 19th century was also a time of great scientific progress for Berlin. The city was home to several important scientific institutions, including the Berlin Academy of Sciences and the Prussian Academy of Sciences, which attracted leading figures in fields like astronomy, biology, and physics. The work of scientists like Max Planck and Albert Einstein in the early 20th century built upon a foundation that had been laid during this era. As Berlin's population grew and its industries flourished, the political and social tensions within the city deepened. The rapid growth of the working class gave rise to organized labor movements and the demand for political reform. The city saw its first major strikes and protests, as well as the growth of political parties advocating for socialism, democracy, and workers' rights. One of the most significant social developments was the rise of the Social Democratic Party, SPD, which emerged as a political force calling for universal suffrage, workers' rights, and social justice. The SPD quickly became the voice of Berlin's working class, and its influence would only grow in the decades to come. Meanwhile, the city's middle and upper classes began to benefit from the wealth generated by the industrial economy. A new bourgeois class emerged, living in fashionable districts like Charlottenburg, and contributing to Berlin's growing cultural and intellectual life. The construction of grand boulevards, palaces, and public squares created an urban environment that reflected the city's newfound power and influence. By the close of the 19th century, Berlin had transformed from a military stronghold to the capital of a unified Germany. It had become the focal point of Europe's industrial revolution, a cultural hub, and a political powerhouse. Its rapid growth in population, culture, and economic influence reflected the larger trends of the era: industrialization, urbanization, and the rise of the nation-state. Berlin's position as the capital of the German Empire set the stage for the dramatic events of the 20th century. The political, social, and economic changes of the late 19th century would fuel the political tensions and conflicts that would later lead to the World Wars, the rise of Nazism, and the division of the city during the Cold War. Berlin's rise in the 19th century, as the political and industrial heart of the German Empire, was followed by a period of unprecedented turmoil and transformation. At the dawn of the 20th century, Berlin found itself on the brink of a new and terrifying era, the First World War, a conflict that would not only change the course of European history but would reshape Berlin and its role in the world. The events of World War I marked the end of the German Empire and the beginning of the Weimar Republic, a new democratic experiment in a country that had once been ruled by emperors. This period of profound change would bring revolution, the fall of an empire, the breakdown of old societal structures, and the rise of new political ideologies that would shape Germany's future. In this segment, we will explore the impact of World War I on Berlin, the collapse of the German monarchy, and the birth of the Weimar Republic, a time of profound political, social, and cultural upheaval. We will also examine how the war and its aftermath fundamentally transformed the city, leaving a legacy that still influences its identity to this day. At the turn of the 20th century, Berlin was a city of great power and great tension. Under the rule of Kaiser Wilhelm II, Germany had become a military superpower, its industries were booming, and its political influence stretched across Europe. Berlin was the capital of a rapidly modernizing and industrializing nation, and the city's streets were filled with the promise of prosperity. But beneath this facade of strength and modernity, there were growing internal tensions. Germany's increasing military ambitions, its complex system of alliances, and its desire to assert itself as the leading European power made it a target for rivals. As Europe's political climate became more fraught, Berlin's leadership found itself caught between the rising tides of nationalism, imperialism, and militarism. The political system in Berlin was increasingly autocratic and dominated by the Kaiser. The aristocracy still wielded significant influence, while social reforms were slow to materialize, causing unrest among the working class. Socialists, labor unions, and political activists in Berlin began to demand greater representation and better working conditions, but the Kaiser's government was unwilling to listen to their calls for change. By 1914, Europe was teetering on the edge of war. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, triggered a series of events that would plunge the continent into World War I. Berlin, like the rest of Europe, was caught in the momentum of imperialism and militarism, and Germany, now an imperial power with an aggressive military stance, was about to face the consequences. When Germany entered World War I in August 1914, it did so with confidence in its military superiority. Berlin, as the capital of the German Empire, became a center of war activity, with military headquarters, government offices, and factories producing weapons and supplies for the war effort. The city saw the mobilization of millions of soldiers, while civilian life was disrupted by rationing, inflation, and increasing scarcity. At first, the war was seen as a patriotic duty. The government in Berlin engaged in a propaganda campaign to rally the public and maintain morale. Citizens were encouraged to support the war effort by buying war bonds, donating goods, and volunteering for service. Yet, as the war dragged on, the mood in Berlin began to change. The casualties mounted, food became scarce, and the promise of a quick victory gave way to the harsh reality of a bloody stalemate on the Western Front. As the war continued, the city of Berlin began to experience the internal pressures of a prolonged conflict. The working class in Berlin, heavily involved in the war industry, became increasingly disillusioned with the government. Strikes broke out, and food shortages led to protests and civil unrest. The war had drained Germany's resources, and the country's military situation grew increasingly dire. By 1917, the situation was critical. The German Empire was on the brink of collapse, and Berlin was caught in the chaos of a crumbling monarchy. The war had not gone according to plan, and Germany's allies were faltering. The United States had entered the war in 1917, and the Allied forces were gaining the upper hand. The economic strain of the war was beginning to overwhelm the country. The people of Berlin were growing increasingly disillusioned with the war and the monarchy. The Kaiser and his military leadership were seen as out of touch with the realities of war. In November 1918, the German Navy's failed attempt at a last-ditch effort against the British led to widespread mutinies in the military and protests in Berlin. The revolution that followed would be known as the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919, and it would mark the end of the German Empire. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, and the monarchy was abolished. Berlin, for the first time in German history, was no longer the seat of an empire. The Weimar Republic was proclaimed, marking the birth of Germany's first democracy. The revolution that brought down the monarchy was initially peaceful, but it set the stage for deep political divisions within the country. The immediate aftermath of the war saw the creation of a new government, but the nation was deeply divided. The country faced the humiliation of Germany's defeat and the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which would impose heavy reparations on Germany and alter the European political landscape for decades to come. Berlin, as the capital of the Weimar Republic, was now the center of a new political order, but the road to stability would be long and fraught with internal strife. The birth of the Weimar Republic in the wake of the German Revolution marked a dramatic shift in Berlin's political landscape. The Weimar Constitution, ratified in 1919, established Germany as a democratic republic. For the first time, the German people had the right to vote for their leaders, and a parliamentary system was created to govern the country. Berlin was the political heart of this new republic, but it was also the epicenter of the tensions that would plague the country for the next decade. The Weimar Republic faced immediate challenges. The Treaty of Versailles imposed heavy reparations on Germany, causing economic hardship and fostering resentment among the population. In Berlin, there were protests, strikes, and frequent uprisings as different factions, socialists, communists, and right-wing extremists, fought for power. Political instability was rampant, and the economic crisis deepened as hyperinflation hit Germany in 1923, causing the value of the mark to plummet. Despite these challenges, Berlin experienced a period of cultural flourishing during the early years of the Weimar Republic. The city became a global hub for the arts and intellectual thought, attracting leading figures in literature, cinema, music, and philosophy. The Berlin cabaret scene, with its avant-garde performances and political satire, became world-renowned. However, this cultural boom would be overshadowed by the political instability of the era. In Berlin, the rise of radical political movements, such as the Nazis and Communists, would eventually lead to the collapse of the Weimar Republic and the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime in the 1930s. Berlin's role in the early 20th century was one of profound transformation. From the height of the German Empire under Kaiser Wilhelm II to the collapse of the monarchy and the birth of the Weimar Republic, the city was at the center of revolutionary change. The First World War and the subsequent German Revolution shattered the old order, and Berlin became the capital of a new democratic experiment. Yet the Weimar Republic was beset by political instability, economic hardship, and social divisions. Despite the cultural vibrancy of the era, Berlin faced enormous challenges that would set the stage for the rise of National Socialism and the fall of the Weimar Republic in the 1930s. The decade following the collapse of the Weimar Republic was one of the most turbulent and tragic in Berlin's history. As the Weimar government struggled with economic collapse, social division, and political chaos, the city of Berlin, once the beacon of culture, intellectualism, and political progress, began its descent into the darkness of Nazi rule. In the early 1930s, Adolf Hitler, a relatively obscure political figure at the time, would capitalize on the turmoil of post-war Germany to rise to power. Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, offered a vision of strength, nationalism, and revanchism, drawing support from a population that had been battered by World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, and the devastating effects of the Great Depression. This period marked the beginning of a terrifying chapter in Berlin's history, one that would see the rise of a totalitarian regime that sought not only to reshape Germany but to dominate the entire European continent. The capital of the Weimar Republic became the epicenter of Nazi ideology, as Berlin transformed from a city of hope and democracy to one of fear, oppression, and murder. The early 1930s were marked by political instability in Berlin. The Great Depression had devastated the global economy, and Germany was particularly hard hit. Unemployment reached astronomical levels, and the middle class, which had once been the backbone of the Weimar Republic, was now struggling. Economic hardship led to growing dissatisfaction with the government and a sense of national humiliation after Germany's defeat in World War I and the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. In Berlin, political extremism began to take hold. The Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, gained ground among both the working class and the middle class, promising a return to national greatness. The Nazis capitalized on widespread disillusionment with the Weimar government and the inability of the ruling coalition to manage the country's economic crisis. The Nazi ideology, which promoted anti-Semitism, Aryan racial superiority, and militarism, began to resonate with a growing number of Germans. By 1932, the Nazi Party had become the largest party in the Reichstag, Germany's parliament. However, despite their success at the polls, Hitler and his party were still not in power. The political system was deeply fractured, and a coalition government was still in control. That changed on January 30, 1933, when President Paul von Hindenburg, under political pressure, appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. This was the beginning of a new era for Berlin, and for Germany as a whole. Within a matter of weeks, Hitler would consolidate power, dismantle the democratic institutions of the Weimar Republic, and establish a dictatorship that would eventually lead to the Second World War. Once in power, Hitler wasted no time in implementing his radical agenda. The Reichstag fire in February 1933. An event that remains shrouded in mystery, was used by the Nazis to justify the suspension of civil liberties and the arrest of political opponents. The fire provided Hitler with the pretext to pass the Reichstag fire decree, which allowed the government to imprison political adversaries and suppress any dissent. Communists, socialists, and liberals were targeted, and the political left was effectively crushed. The Enabling Act, passed in March 1933, gave Hitler the power to enact laws without the approval of the Reichstag, effectively rendering him a dictator. At this point, Berlin, and Germany, had officially become a totalitarian state. With the Nazi Party firmly in control, Hitler began to reshape Berlin and the rest of Germany in his own image. The Berlin Olympics in 1936 were used as a propaganda tool, showcasing a new Germany that was both powerful and unified under Nazi rule. The event was carefully orchestrated to highlight the achievements of the regime while hiding the persecution of Jews and other marginalized groups. As the capital of Nazi Germany, Berlin was transformed into the center of Nazi propaganda, military planning, and state control. Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, used Berlin as a stage for the Nazi Party's massive rallies, public speeches, and films that glorified the regime and its leader, Hitler. The city was filled with Nazi symbolism, with the iconic swastika flying over government buildings and statues of Hitler placed in public spaces. The Nazis carefully constructed a cult of personality around Adolf Hitler, who was portrayed as the savior of Germany, the man who would restore the glory of the German people. In Berlin, the propaganda machine worked tirelessly to disseminate this image. Hitler youth groups marched through the streets, indoctrinating a new generation with Nazi ideals, while the SS, Schutzstaffel, and Gestapo monitored the population, rooting out opposition and ensuring compliance with the regime's policies. In Berlin, the Nuremberg rallies and parades were regular occurrences. The Nazi leadership used these events to create a sense of unity, strength, and loyalty to the Führer. Meanwhile, the SS and the Gestapo carried out their brutal crackdown on Jews, political dissidents, and anyone considered an enemy of the state. As the Nazi regime consolidated power, Jewish people in Berlin were systematically stripped of their rights. They were forced out of public life, with laws banning them from public offices, universities, and even many businesses. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 officially codified anti-Semitic discrimination, marking the beginning of what would become the Holocaust. Berlin was also home to concentration camps, where political enemies, Jews, and other groups deemed undesirable by the Nazis were sent to be exterminated or subjected to forced labor. The first concentration camp, Sachsenhausen, was located just outside Berlin, and the city was a key center for the logistics of Nazi repression. By the late 1930s, Berlin was not only the heart of Nazi Germany, it was the center of Nazi aggression in Europe. Berlin was where Hitler's most ambitious plans for territorial expansion were discussed, planned, and executed. The policy of appeasement by Britain and France allowed Germany to remilitarize the Rhineland, annex Austria in the Anschluss of 1938, and demand the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland, triggering the outbreak of World War II. Berlin became the center of military operations as Hitler's vision of a greater Germany began to unfold. The early victories in Poland, Norway, France, and the Balkans made Berlin feel invincible. The city was transformed into a war machine, with the military-industrial complex working around the clock to supply the German army. Despite the early successes, Germany's fortunes began to turn as the war dragged on. In 1943, the Allied forces began to turn the tide, with the Battle of Stalingrad marking a significant defeat for Germany. By 1945, the Allies had successfully invaded Germany from the west, and the Red Army was closing in from the east. Berlin, once the center of Nazi power, was now the focus of an impending Allied assault. The final battle for Berlin took place in April-May 1945, as the Soviet Red Army encircled the city. The destruction of Berlin was intense. Bombings by the Allies had already left much of the city in ruins, but the final assault by the Soviets was devastating. On May 2, 1945, the city fell, and Adolf Hitler was dead, having taken his own life in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin on April 30, 1945. The collapse of Berlin marked the end of Nazi rule, the defeat of Hitler, and the final chapter of the Third Reich. Berlin lay in ruins, its once proud symbols of Nazi power now reduced to rubble. Berlin's transformation from a cultural and political center to the capital of Nazi tyranny is one of the darkest chapters in the city's history. The city that had once been a symbol of progress, art, and intellectualism became the heart of a regime defined by oppression, violence, and war. The fall of Berlin in May 1945 marked the end of the Third Reich, but it also marked the beginning of a new and bitter chapter in the city's history. Berlin, which had once been the heart of Nazi Germany, was now divided into four sectors, each controlled by one of the victorious powers of World War II, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. The Cold War was dawning, and the division of Berlin into East and West would come to symbolize the ideological divide between the capitalist West and the communist East. The Berlin Wall, constructed in 1961, would stand as one of the most iconic symbols of this divide, a concrete barrier that not only physically separated the city but also embodied the larger geopolitical struggle between the Soviet bloc and the Western powers. In this segment, we will explore the post-war division of Berlin, the construction of the Berlin Wall, and the Cold War years that shaped the city's modern identity. This is the story of a city caught between ideological extremes, its inhabitants divided by political lines but bound together by a shared history. The immediate aftermath of World War II was a chaotic and uncertain time for Berlin. The city, which had been the center of Nazi power, was now in ruins. The Allied forces, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France, each took control of a sector of Berlin. The Soviet Union controlled the eastern part of the city, while the United States, United Kingdom, and France administered the western sectors. Berlin, located deep within the Soviet-controlled zone of East Germany, was a capital city in enemy territory, and this was not lost on the Soviet authorities. The city's division symbolized the larger division of Germany, which had been split into two states, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, backed by the Western powers, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, created under Soviet influence. Berlin, while divided, was officially neutral, but the situation on the ground quickly became tense. The Western Allies and the Soviets had different visions for the future of Germany. The Soviet Union wanted to install a communist government in Germany, while the West sought to create a democratic and capitalist state. The Berlin blockade, which began in 1948, was the first major crisis in this ideological struggle. In June 1948, the Soviets initiated the Berlin blockade, cutting off all land and water access to the western sectors of the city. The blockade was a direct response to the Western Allies' decision to introduce a new currency in West Germany and West Berlin, which the Soviets saw as a threat to their control over the eastern part of the city. For nearly a year, West Berlin was completely cut off from the outside world. The Soviet Union hoped to force the Western Allies out of Berlin and establish full control over the city. However, the Western powers did not give up on Berlin. Instead, they launched the Berlin Airlift, a massive logistical operation to supply West Berlin with food, fuel, and other essentials by air. For 11 months, Allied planes flew in supplies to West Berlin, keeping the city alive and demonstrating the resolve of the Western powers to stand against Soviet pressure. The Berlin Airlift became a powerful symbol of the West's determination to defend democracy and freedom against Soviet communism. In May 1949, the Soviets finally lifted the blockade, but the crisis had solidified Berlin's role as a symbol of the Cold War. The city was a focal point of the struggle between the East and the West. Despite the end of the Berlin blockade, tensions between the Soviet Union and the Western powers continued to escalate. By the early 1960s, the Soviet Union and its allies had consolidated control over East Germany and East Berlin. At the same time, the Western Allies had built a thriving democracy in West Berlin, which became a beacon of freedom in the heart of the Communist East. The situation in Berlin had become increasingly untenable for the Soviet-backed East German government, led by Walter Ulbricht. Thousands of East Germans were fleeing the communist regime by crossing into West Berlin, seeking refuge in the capitalist West. This mass exodus of refugees was a major embarrassment for the Soviet-backed regime, and something had to be done to stop it. On August 13, 1961, the East German government, with Soviet support, began building the Berlin Wall, a physical barrier separating East Berlin from West Berlin. The wall was made of concrete, barbed wire, and watchtowers, and it was designed to prevent East Germans from fleeing to the West. For nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall stood as a symbol of the Cold War, a barrier not only between two parts of the city but also between the East and the West, between communism and capitalism. Families were torn apart, friends were separated, and the city's once unified culture was fractured. Berlin became a city of walls, not just the physical wall, but ideological and emotional walls that divided people on both sides. While West Berlin flourished under the protection of the Western Allies, becoming a prosperous and vibrant hub of capitalist democracy, East Berlin languished under the communist regime. The city's eastern sector was marked by state surveillance, restriction of freedoms, and severe limitations on personal and political rights. The Stasi, the secret police of East Germany, kept a tight grip on the population, monitoring all aspects of life and silencing any opposition. The Berlin Wall physically separated the two parts of the city, but it also represented the ideological divide between two opposing systems. The Western Allies promoted democracy, personal freedom, and market capitalism, while the Soviet-backed government in East Berlin enforced a system of state control, central planning, and restricted freedoms. In East Berlin, the Stasi operated with impunity, spying on the population and ensuring that anyone with pro-Western sympathies was quickly silenced. People were denied the right to travel, to express dissent, or even to have free access to information. The wall, as much as it was a physical barrier, was a constant reminder of the oppression of communism. Meanwhile, in West Berlin, life was characterized by a sense of freedom and opportunity. Though the city was surrounded by the Berlin Wall, West Berliners lived in a democratic society where free elections, press freedom, and individual rights were guaranteed. The city became a symbol of what the West had to offer, in stark contrast to the tightly controlled society across the wall. For nearly 30 years, the Berlin Wall stood as a symbol of division, both within the city and across the world. But by the late 1980s, the global political landscape was shifting. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, had begun to relax its strict policies of control. The reforms of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, opened the door for greater freedom within the Eastern Bloc, and demands for political change began to grow. In East Germany, protests against the regime became more widespread, and the pressure to open the wall became intense. On the evening of November 9, 1989, the East German government announced that East Berliners could freely cross the border into West Berlin. Thousands of people flooded to the wall, and within hours, border guards opened the gates. The Berlin Wall was breached, and for the first time in nearly 3 decades, the people of Berlin could cross freely from east to west. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a momentous event, not just for Berlin but for the world. It marked the end of the Cold War, the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, and the beginning of the reunification of Germany. The wall, once a symbol of division, became a symbol of freedom and unity. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter in Berlin's history. The city, once divided by concrete and ideology, was now reunited in the spirit of freedom, democracy, and unity. Berlin's role as a symbol of the Cold War had come to an end, but the legacy of its division continued to shape the city for years to come. In November 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall marked a new beginning for the city, a reunified Berlin emerging from the ruins of decades of division. What once seemed like an impossible dream became a reality as the physical barrier, which had separated families, friends, and ideologies, came down in a single, symbolic moment. But the fall of the wall wasn't just a celebration of unity, it was the beginning of a profound journey, a journey that would see Berlin, now the capital of unified Germany, navigate the complexities of rebuilding and reconciling the fractured halves of the city. Berlin's reunification was not an easy process. The city had been divided for over 40 years, and its economic, social, and cultural landscapes were vastly different between the East and the West. The challenges of rebuilding the city, integrating the two halves, and dealing with the legacy of communism in the East were immense. Yet, Berlin's transformation into the modern, thriving capital of Germany and Europe is a testament to its resilience and its spirit of reconciliation and progress. In this segment, we'll explore the path Berlin took in the years following German reunification in 1990, the city's role in post-Cold War Europe, and how it emerged as a global cultural and political center in the 21st century. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the world watched in awe as East and West Berliners flooded the streets to celebrate their newfound freedom. The euphoria was palpable. But, behind the celebrations, the process of reunifying Berlin was a complex and difficult task. The two Berlins, East and West, had been living under completely different economic systems, governments, and societies for decades. The East was governed by a communist regime that had prioritized state control, while the West had prospered under capitalism, democratic rule, and Western influence. The economic gap between the two halves was stark. West Berlin was part of a thriving capitalist economy, with its booming industries and international connections. In contrast, East Berlin, while still holding architectural charm and some remnants of the old world, had been heavily influenced by Soviet control. Its economy was centrally planned, and the people had been under strict surveillance by the Stasi, the East German secret police. The city's infrastructure was crumbling, and the daily life of the average East Berliner was far from the prosperity experienced by their Western counterparts. After the fall of the wall, the government of West Germany, under Chancellor Helmut Kohl, quickly began to plan for the reunification of Germany. The process, however, would require careful negotiation. East Germany, under the leadership of Egon Krenz, was also in disarray. The communist regime was collapsing, and the Soviet Union, under Mikhail Gorbachev, had already begun its own reforms. The Iron Curtain was coming down across Eastern Europe, and the momentum for reunification was undeniable. On October 3, 1990, the German reunification was officially completed. Berlin, the symbolic heart of Germany, was once again united. East Berlin and West Berlin were no longer two separate entities, but one unified city. The process of unification, however, was just beginning. The task of rebuilding Berlin was monumental. As the new capital of unified Germany, Berlin had to reconcile the divide between East and West, not just in physical terms, but also in terms of culture, identity, and economy. The process of reunification wasn't just about tearing down the Berlin Wall, it was about reconciling two different worlds that had developed over decades. One of the immediate challenges was the economic integration of East and West. The former East Germany was still in economic turmoil, and the transition from a communist state to a capitalist economy was difficult. The mark of the GDR, East Germany, had little value in the wider economy, and East Germans had to adjust to the West German Deutsche Mark. Massive subsidies from West Germany were used to help rebuild the East, but the process took time. Many of the state-owned industries in the East were unsustainable and had to be shut down or privatized, leading to mass unemployment and economic instability. Berlin itself was a symbol of this divide. The reconstruction of Berlin was slow and complex, with significant investment needed to rebuild the infrastructure, housing, and public services. The famous Berlin TV Tower, once the pride of East Berlin, stood as a reminder of the city's communist past, while the Brandenburg Gate, symbolizing German unity, was restored as a focal point of the reunited city. Perhaps the most poignant and symbolic challenge was the task of rebuilding the city's identity. For the people of Berlin, both East and West, the city had been a symbol of division for nearly half a century. The residents of East Berlin had lived under communist rule, with limited freedom and constant surveillance. West Berliners, on the other hand, had been isolated in their city, surrounded by communist-controlled East Germany. These two worlds had not just been divided physically by the Berlin Wall, but ideologically and psychologically as well. Following reunification, Berlin was officially made the capital of unified Germany, a decision that was both controversial and symbolic. The process of moving the capital from Bonn, the provisional capital during the Cold War, to Berlin was a delicate political decision, reflecting the new national unity. Some argued that Bonn, which had served as the center of the post-war government, was a more stable choice. However, the overwhelming sentiment was that Berlin, with its historical significance and symbolic power, was the right choice to be the capital of a reunited Germany. Berlin's return to being the capital of Germany was marked by the reconstruction of key landmarks and government buildings, many of which had been damaged or neglected during the division. The Reichstag building, a symbol of German democracy, was restored and modernized. The Brandenburg Gate, which had stood at the heart of the division, was reopened as a symbol of unity. The reunification process, however, was not without its difficulties. Berlin's urban landscape had to be reimagined for the modern era. Many areas of the city had been neglected during the division, and parts of East Berlin were in disrepair. The physical rebuilding of the city was a huge task, but it was equally important to create a new cultural identity for the reunited city. Berlin had to reconcile its legacy as a city of division with its new identity as the capital of a unified Germany. The city became a melting pot of cultures, ideas, and histories. As Berlin transformed, it became a cultural and political hub, drawing artists, intellectuals, businesspeople, and politicians from around the world. As the political and economic processes of reunification continued, Berlin began to experience a cultural renaissance. The Berlin of the 1990s and 2000s became a global center for art, music, fashion, and intellectual thought. The fall of the Berlin Wall had opened the door for a new generation of artists and creatives who saw Berlin not just as a capital but as a canvas, a place to experiment and explore new ideas. The Berlin club scene, which had been in its infancy before reunification, exploded in the years following the fall of the wall. Clubs like Berghain and Tresor became legendary for their electronic music and avant-garde atmosphere, drawing people from all over the world to experience Berlin's underground culture. The city also became a haven for artists. Berlin's art scene blossomed, with the city being home to many world-renowned galleries, museums, and art installations. The city's unique mix of history and modernity made it an attractive destination for artists who were drawn to its creative energy. Berlin's architectural landscape also began to reflect this new chapter. The historic buildings of the old city were carefully preserved, while new, modern constructions like the Berlin Hauptbahnhof, the Central Station, and the Berlin Philharmonie brought a sleek, contemporary feel to the city. Berlin became a place where the past and future converged. Berlin's reunification was not simply the restoration of a city, it was the rebirth of a cultural and political symbol. The city that had once been divided by war, ideology, and politics was now reunited, with a vibrant mix of old and new. The rebuilding of Berlin was a long, difficult process, but the results speak for themselves. Berlin is now a city that embodies the spirit of resilience. A city that has overcome the darkest periods of history and has emerged as a beacon of freedom, creativity, and unity in the modern world. Berlin, as the capital of unified Germany, is a symbol of what can be achieved when nations come together. It remains a dynamic, ever-evolving city that reflects both the struggles of its past and the promise of its future. As we conclude our journey through the turbulent history of Berlin, we see how the city, born from division and destruction, has risen time and again to become a symbol of resilience, unity, and transformation. From its roots in the Prussian Empire, to its near destruction during World War II, to the Cold War division that tore it apart, Berlin's story is one of survival, rebirth, and the relentless pursuit of freedom and identity. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 marked the most significant turning point, a moment that not only reunited a city but united the hearts and minds of people around the world. Since then, Berlin has embraced its role as the capital of a reunited Germany, a cultural and political hub at the crossroads of history, where the echoes of the past meet the promise of the future. Today, Berlin is more than just a city, it is a global center of innovation, creativity, and progress. It is a city that never stops evolving, yet always remembers where it has been. A city where history, culture, and modernity exist side by side, telling the story of how a divided world became united in spirit and purpose. As we close this chapter of Berlin's history, I want to hear your thoughts. What part of Berlin's journey stood out to you the most? Was there a particular moment in the city's history that caught your attention? Or perhaps you visited Berlin yourself and experienced its transformation firsthand. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to read your perspectives on the history and future of this fascinating city. Also, I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your part of the world? I always love seeing how far these stories travel, so don't forget to drop your location in the comments. I find it fascinating how interconnected we all are through history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Berlin's past, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more stories of history, culture, and transformation. Your support means a lot, and it helps us keep exploring the world's most iconic cities and their untold stories. Berlin's history is far from over. As the world continues to change, Berlin will remain a city that bridges the past and the future, a city that reflects the resilience of its people and the enduring spirit of unity. From its darkest days to its brightest triumphs, Berlin's journey is a testament to the power of reinvention. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the heart of Europe. Berlin, a city once divided, is now unified, and its future is brighter than ever. Until next time, let's continue to learn from the past as we move forward into the future.